friends, May Flom here. Today we're going to explore faux wax seal stamping. For this you will need a surface. Now, I do paper a lot, but you can do other materials too. It just needs to be able to take a heat gun aimed at it until the powder melts for a good amount of time. Or if you have another method of heating and melting your powder and then pouring it in, that would work as well. You'll also need some rubber stamps, some archival ink, and some embossing powder as well as your heat tool. So I've got a couple little things here, and I've just got a couple different embossing powders that we're going to try out on some different samples. You can use this on any altered arts, scrapbooking, card making, whatever you like. And there's two different methods that I use. The first one is when I want to make sure that a good base layer sticks, I will use either an embossing ink or a watermark ink, in other words, a clear ink pad, and put a little ink down before I sprinkle a healthy amount of embossing powder. Now, for this technique, you are not going to want to shake off all the embossing powder, just some of it if there's just way too much. Then you're going to want to go ahead and stamp your stamp. It does not need to be freshly stamped. You can pre-stamp it before you do the embossing. The little bit of ink on there is really just to help make some color for some contrast. Then you're going to heat from the underside. So this is the real thing is, number one, the material, you have to be able to heat it through to do this method. And you can use tweezers if that helps to hold an item that's a little small and gets a little hot. You have to be able to heat it from the underside so that the powder does not go flying. And that's really the criteria for the materials, that your material doesn't catch on fire and material allows to heat from the underside. You cannot heat from the top with this method because the embossing powder is not stuck to anything. What makes it stick is when it heats and it melts, then it will stick. But before it is heated and started to melt, it does not work. Then you just stamp your stamp into it. I usually wait a couple seconds and lift it off, and check this out. Not only will it show, and you see you've got our black ink there, but there's a lot of texture to this because, and this is kind of a clear embossing ink. It's not really an opaque one, so it's a little different, but it will show up and it will be so lovely because there'll be a cool texture, like I said, like a faux wax seal. Now, I mentioned before that there's other methods of heating. I personally have an old, and I don't think they're made anymore, ultra thick embossing powder that used to be made for doing all kinds of interesting things with really thick embossing powder, almost like wax seal kind of stuff. Now this one, notice how this one is starting to go on the one side, but not the other. So I'm going to move my heat gun around here. Anyhow, it's a little pot thing that you can actually melt the embossing powder in it and then pour the molten embossing powder like you would a wax seal. So in that case, you can do thicker materials. You can do all kinds of other materials. Now, on this one here, I get the top layer to melt, but there's middle stuff that we need to make sure that the stuff in the middle is melted. So you see me keep on going before I get my little letter M stamp out here. And could you use clear stamps? It's possible. I just have never had really good luck. It's a different material. The rubber of rubber stamps is a little hardier material, and I just think it works better. And there you can see, so this one, we had such thick embossing powder that it actually touched the wood block in a few places. I just love the look of this. It's such an interesting way to work, and especially for scrapbooking, you can do this on an element and then put that element on the page. So if for some reason it messed up or it didn't look the way you wanted, no worries, because you're not working on your actual finished page. Now I'm going to show you a fail. So this cork paper, I have done this on, but I've done it where I poured melted embossing powder on. I'm going to give this a try, and I'm going to show you what's going to happen. And I'll tell you in advance, what's going to happen is it's too thick and it has an adhesive sheet attached to the back. So you cannot melt the embossing powder from underneath. And what that means is you'll have to melt the embossing powder from the top. And this is why we don't do that, at least not initially, because it blows. Can you see all the embossing powder blowing all over my desk? for demonstrative purposes, yeah, it's not going to work well. It's going to be super thin and a lot of embossing powder blows all over and makes a mess. Now, will it work? And as you saw me do here, I put 2 different colors of embossing powder just to remind you, you can mix and match. You don't have to just do one color. So it kind of works, but the other thing I did here was not stamp our butterfly stamp. And what that does is there's no contrast. You can't see the stamp as well without a little bit of ink on there. And I use archival inks because they stick really well. They're not going to smear. They're not going to react. They're going to stay. Stays-on inks will work as well. I'm going to do one more example here. And this time what I'm going to show you is I've got some down there and I've heated it. And while it is hot, remember, it's kind of soft while it's hot. As soon as it cools, it's hard. So while it's kind of soft, though, it also will stick to things. So I'm pouring a second layer of embossing powder on while the initial base layer is hot to thicken it. So remember, if you do this and you're like, oh gosh, it wasn't enough, don't give up. Just add more powder and continue to heat. And as you can see, again, we're just pretty close there, but just let it melt away. And before you know it, and you see I'm going on the top now, that's because enough of it was melted that I knew it wouldn't blow away. We stamp our stamp in, pull it off. It is such an easy technique, but it's such a cool technique because there's so many approaches to it. There's so many uses for it. You can use it across basically any kind of paper craft or mixed media crafting. So it's definitely a favorite for a long time, for many, many years of mine. And I was happy to make this video. In the description, you'll find some links to some other creators that are doing videos today on YouTube with stamping on other surfaces and different techniques and ideas. So be sure to check them all out. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe for future videos.